It's been 6 months since President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong Un came to an agreement on denuclearization. And so far, there appears to be little movement in that direction. In fact, new satellite images unveiled this week show at least 13 missile bases that North Korea has not declared. And during a trip to Singapore this week, Vice President Mike Pence told NBC News the U.S. will not demand a complete list of all North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile sites before Trump and Kim meet for a second time next year. Even so, he said the U.S. does need to see results.
I think it will be absolutely imperative in this next summit that we come away with a plan for identifying all of the weapons in question, identifying all the development sites, allowing for inspections of those sites, and a plan for dismantling nuclear weapons. Look, the goal here is the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Pence also said the U.S. will keep North Korean sanctions in place for now, but there are plenty of people questioning whether the U.S. should be meeting with Kim at all, without a full list of weapons in hand. Joining me to talk about this and much more is former Undersecretary of State and U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Nicholas Burns. He now teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there's a lot we realize that we don't know, but there was this agreement reached in June. What understanding do we have of the reality of the situation in North Korea right now in terms of its denuclearization?
Well, we really don't have a lot of progress here. I do think President Trump was right to turn to diplomacy. A year ago today, there was a threat of a war between the United States and North Korea. Right to turn to diplomacy to see if there's a deal there. But the North Koreans have done practically nothing. As the Vice President said, they haven't identified their holdings of nuclear material and nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. They're continuing to build ballistic missile sites. They've suspended tests of nuclear missiles, which is a good thing, but they haven't taken any appreciable steps. And I think the real problem here is that President Trump has oversold it. President Trump's been saying there is no longer a problem. There's still a problem.
Well, what will he be headed into? Is it just a repeat of the meeting in June, given what little progress there seems to have been made in the last 6 months?
The North Koreans don't appear to want to deal with our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's a very experienced negotiator. And so it may be that President Trump wants to have another summit to press President Kim Jong Un, who's the only decision maker in North Korea, for progress. That's generally the job of a negotiator of the Secretary of State. So this is a little bit of a risk for the President, because if he can't show results after this next meeting, then you have a situation where the North Koreans still have a substantial nuclear weapons threat. It hasn't been diminished. Of course, we don't have a threat of immediate war, but the problem's still there.
People were so optimistic, as you know, coming out of that big summit. It was a great photo op, lots of great optics for the administration. The country felt it could exhale a little bit. What do you think the likelihood is of any sort of declaration of denuclearization ultimately?
You know, ultimately, I think Kim Jong Un is not going to give up his nuclear weapons, not at this pace and not in this negotiation. It's his insurance policy against attack from the United States, against being overthrown perhaps. And so I think we're in a very difficult negotiation. At some point, we're going to have to say he's not living up to his end of the bargain. We'll have to go back to economic sanctions. We've also lost the thread there because the president's been talking that the problem's over. China and Russia have let up on the sanctions.
For looking at what the U.S. has done, there has been a stoppage, as we understand it, of missile testing. I think we can be reasonably sure that has happened.
Yes.
There's been the return of hostages, and sanctions have not been lifted. What does that say about how the U.S. is operating right now?
Well, I think the U.S. is right to say that we should continue to have sanctions, but the president needs to put his shoulder behind them because he hasn't been pressuring China and Russia and other countries to live up to them. We're also not traveling on the same track with South Korea. The South Korean president is from the Peace Party. He is a little bit even ahead of President Trump trying to normalize relations. So we don't have enough leverage on our side right now, economic leverage, political leverage, pushing the North Koreans to make the compromises that we need.
Moving on to Saudi Arabia, 17 people associated with the killing of Jamal Khashoggi there have now U.S. sanctions against them. What does this say about the U.S. stance in terms of Saudi Arabia and what happened in that case?
I think that the Trump administration, specifically Mike Pompeo, recognized this was an abominable deed by the Saudi government. Jamal Khashoggi was a permanent resident of our country. He lived in Virginia, and he was murdered. and very likely murdered at the instructions of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So the action today is a positive action. It's our Treasury Department identifying 17 individuals, I'm sure in cooperation with the Saudi authorities, who are responsible for the murder. It, of course, does not point the finger at the Crown Prince. The U.S., the Trump administration, I think, is probably not wanting to put that kind of punitive action on one of our strongest partners in the Middle East on other issues.
Well, there are a lot in terms of economics at stake here, whether it gets tied back to the Crown Prince or not. So how does the U.S., how do you see the administration balancing how it handles Saudi Arabia going forward?
It's a very difficult balancing act because I think there's been public pressure, congressional pressure, Turkish government pressure for the U.S. to do something, to show the Saudis that we can't tolerate this type of behavior, particularly against someone who lived in our country, a member of the press corps. On the other hand, I think that President Trump has said we need the Saudis for oil. We need the Saudis to contain Iran. We need the Saudis to buy U.S. military equipment. So the president clearly doesn't want to go too far in punishing the Saudis. This looks to be the compromise the administration has made. Go after the lower level people. Don't go after the person who ordered the crime.
What do you think? Is it enough? Well, who wouldn't be satisfied until it gets tied back to the Crown Prince, as it seemed to be a couple of weeks ago?
Well, if you look at the Saudi government today announced it was going to execute 11 of these 17 people, and it presented its own case. It said that Mr. Khashoggi was not supposed to be killed, that he was just supposed to be kidnapped, apparently, and brought back to Saudi Arabia, that it was a mission gone awry. I'm not sure the facts will support that case. I think it's probably made up, but it's the case the Saudis are going with. They want to protect their crown prince. He's the son of the king. In the royal family, if the crown prince were prosecuted, well, it's almost unimaginable in a feudal aristocracy like Saudi Arabia that would happen. Where
does Turkey come into all of this? And again, in terms of what the administration is doing, do you see the administration acting on its own, or are they acting on the behest of Turkey and President Erdogan?
This is a complex Byzantine environment. The Turks and Saudis are rivals for power in the Sunni Muslim world. The Turks apparently have a tape recording of the murder itself. They've been pushing the Saudis to do more, and they've been pushing the United States to take action against Saudi Arabia. So if you're the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, or President Trump, this is a very complicated set of relations to try to manage at a difficult time.
Well, speaking of how they're managed, a new ambassador to Saudi Arabia was potential appointment of an ambassador was just announced this week, an Army general. There hasn't been anybody in that position, as I understand it, virtually from the first days of the Trump administration. What does that signal?
Well, John Abizaid is a former four-star general. He was in charge of our Central Command during the Iraq War. He's a very skilled officer. He's a fluent speaker of Arabic. I know him well, and I greatly admire him. We needed an ambassador in Saudi Arabia. I think General Abizaid will make a good ambassador. You know, we've had embassies vacant in more than 60 countries. The Trump administration is the slowest administration in modern history at appointing ambassadors. They don't put a lot of stock in diplomacy. Now that Secretary Pompeo is in office, he's trying to quicken the pace. He understands you can't have an effective American foreign policy without an ambassador in Ankara in Turkey, without an ambassador in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and many other places in the world. So frankly, I welcome the appointment of General Abizaid.
Is he there as an enforcer to keep eyes on the ground?
I think, you know, we have a difficult relationship with Saudi Arabia. What they did was wrong in killing Jamal Khashoggi. They've got to pay for it. There has to be some kind of punitive action. The next move, I think, should be, and there's a lot of congressional pressure here, deny the Saudis arms for the war in Yemen. There's been a massive cholera outbreak. There's famine. At least 15,000 civilians dead. The Saudis and Emiratis are using our weapons, American weapons. We should take that supply chain of weapons away. That would hurt the Saudis. It would be our response to the killing. It would also hopefully do something to end that terrible war in Yemen.
I know you were just in Europe last week. I want to ask a couple quick questions about Brexit. Prime Minister Theresa May has said that deal or no deal it would happen. Is this a done deal?
Well, Britain and the European Union have come to an agreement on the separation of Britain from the EU, Brexit. 5 cabinet ministers have resigned. There's a big controversy within the Prime Minister's Conservative Party. I'm not sure that she has sufficient strength to get a vote through the British Parliament. They have to vote on this, a successful vote. And if she loses a vote in the British Parliament, it's very likely that her government will collapse and she will resign as Prime Minister and there'll be new elections. And then you wonder, Will the British Parliament and British people demand a second vote?
Well, that's the question. That has been the question since that very first morning when everybody woke up and the first thing they Googled was, what is Brexit?
June 2016.
Do you see this going back to a vote of the people?
Not automatically, because this is a democratic country like ours. The British people did vote 51.9 to 49.1, a narrow margin, but they did vote for it. So I think politicians are reluctant to say, well, that vote didn't count because we didn't like the results. But on the other hand, this is a disaster for the United Kingdom economically. To leave the EU on such terms, their economy is going to suffer because of it in the short and long term. If the Labour Party, the opposition party, demands a new vote, I think that it'll happen, and we'll have to see if the British government heads in that direction.
Well, Nicholas Burns, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for your expertise.
Thank you.